Good afternoon. I'm speaking with Yale's distinguished professor of law, Akhil Reed Amar, especially distinguished for his work on the United States Constitution. And thank you very much, Akhil, for making yourself available today.
It's a treat to be with you. Thank you.
Well, we at the LA Review of Books have been following your volumes of the last years. You are a very prolific writer on the Constitution. We've had 3 reviews and 3 books come out in almost as many years. I have to commend you for not only the pace, but the quality of what you're writing.
Thanks so much.
We started about a little over 3 years ago. How time flies. Actually, it was almost 4 years ago. I take it back. With the first book that we reviewed, which was your book, America's Unwritten Constitution. And our reviewer at that time was, well, he was sort of from the other camp, Professor Garner, Brian Garner, who had just published a book with the late, well, now late Justice Scalia, advocating originalism and adherence to the literal language of text. So our reviewer then, Professor Garner, wasn't terribly impressed. For him, I guess, that even the title, Unwritten Constitution, was sort of a contradiction in terms. But in that book, you made a big case for the idea that there's many sources that we need to look to really understand the document. Isn't that right?
Indeed. The title was provocative. For some folks, them's fighting words. What do you mean, unwritten, you Yale law professor, you? In the Turnabout is Fair Play department in the new book, I actually have an essay reviewing Scalia and Garner. So there.
All right. The tables have turned.
But with all due respect to Brian Garner, he's not a constitutional law professor, and indeed neither was his distinguished co-author, Antonin Scalia. And here's what I mean with that. Those of us who study constitutional law read it as a whole. Those who decide cases, like Justice Scalia, often see the Constitution case by case, clause by clause, and they might think that the relevant unit of analysis is the word or the sentence or the clause. Scalia was also a grammarian, so was Garner, but our Constitution's greatest interpreters, beginning with John Marshall, did not just assess the Constitution clause by clause, word by word, sentence by sentence. The most famous sentence, perhaps the most famous case, McCulloch versus Maryland, is we must never forget it is the Constitution we are expounding, by which Marshall meant the whole thing, its larger theme, as distinct from a particular word or clause. Every book that I've written, and there was even an earlier one in 2005, has tried to see the Constitution as a whole, but each one has approached it from a different angle. I did, in 2005, write a textual book that follows the fact of the Constitution clause by clause by clause, but tried to give you a sense of how all the clauses added up. That was called America's Constitution, a biography. Precisely because I thought that was missing a lot, because the Constitution is more than the text. America's Unwritten Constitution tries to openly acknowledge ways of being faithful to the Constitution as a whole without always obsessing on each individual word or sentence. So those two fit together. America's Constitution with biography was textual. America's Unwritten Constitution was designed to show you, the reader, ways of going beneath, beyond, behind the text, while remaining ultimately faithful to the text as a whole and its larger spirit. And then there are two more volumes, as you've mentioned, that carry forward the project from yet additional angles.
Well, yeah, let's talk about those, because just a little over a year ago, we reviewed your volume, The Law of the Land. There we had a colleague, equally distinguished colleague, our friend Professor Chemerinsky from University of California at Irvine, and he was mostly appreciative of your book, where you delved into the idea that regional differences impact the interpretation and enforcement of the Constitution. So there's one of the other angles you were talking about.
Indeed. So in 2005, I looked at the Constitution textually. In 2012, I examined it methodologically. Each chapter of the Unwritten Constitution talked about a different non-textual tool or technique. In 2015, I looked at it geographically, identifying the different perspectives that on the Constitution that appear when you look at it from different states and from different regions. Anyone who wonders about that should just think about the election that now looms before us. The world looks a little different if you're in California than, say, in Texas or Wyoming. California is deeply blue, and Texas not so much. Wyoming not so much. So that book, which is really kind of a collection of stories, it does not need to be read start to finish or in any order, examined various constitutional figures, persons, decision makers, and ideas and spaces from the perspective of different states. My California chapter was all about Tony Kennedy and how it's not a coincidence that the one Republican on the court who gets it on gay rights comes from gay-friendly California. And it began with a chapter on Abe Lincoln, in which I argued that his views about secession were powerfully shaped by Illinois, by the Midwestern milieu from which he sprang. Hugo Black gave us a Southern perspective on the Constitution in some very interesting ways, and so on.
And well, that book, as I said, was very thoughtfully and largely favorably received by your colleague, Professor Chemerinsky. But then, not much later for us, towards the end of 2005, you graced us with a review yourself, this time of Justice Breyer's book, The Court and the World. And in fact, that review ended up, at least in part, in your most recent volume that we just reviewed recently, and that is the Constitution Today. Isn't that right?
It is. The LA Review of Books is an extraordinary venue. It's a national treasure. I grew up in California, but I'm now on the East Coast, and the LA Review of Books is perhaps counterbalanced by another national treasure, the New York Review of Books, which is sometimes teasingly referred to as the New York Review of each other's books, because you often have books written by folks who have reviewed other people's books in those same pages. And so X reviews Y book, and Y reviews Z's book, and Z reviews X's book. And so it goes.
And so it goes. Well, first of all, obviously, at LA Review, we are honored to be mentioned in the same breath with our distinguished Eastern colleagues. But I'll also add that we are trying to be less inbred out here in our choice of reviewers and our editors and in the books we review as well. So I hope we succeed.
And I think you've largely succeeded in that.
Well, thank you again. Well, with the Constitution Today, which is your most recent book, I asked a prominent litigator and appellate lawyer in town, Laura Brill, to review it. It turns out, I didn't know this when I asked her, but it turns out that she took a class from you at Columbia Law School, which we disclosed in a note at the end, just in case anybody. She did not tell me what grade she got, so I don't know how how good a student she was, but she's a fantastic lawyer now, one of our best. And she was very, very.
The internet makes clear that she did graduate at the absolute top of her class. I think I can say that without violating the book.
Well, and she's the top of the class as far as litigation counsel in Los Angeles go. She was very impressed by your book, and which, as she described it, was really sort of a set of topics, a set of essays dealing with some of the most vital topics relating to the Constitution today, drawing, I guess, mostly on things you had already written, if I understand it.
So this is yet a different perspective on the Constitution. As I said, every one of my books tries to see the Constitution as a whole, not one clause or one part, but every book ideally talks about rights and structure, about the Constitution both in court and out of court, ideally says something about every era of every century, at least, of our national history. But each one does so from a different angle. In 2005, textual. In 2012, interpretive and methodological. In 2015, geographic. This one, the angle is current events. In the book, I try to engage the most important constitutional cases and controversies and conversations of my adult lifetime. From OJ on one coast to the Clinton impeachment on the other coast, from Bush versus Gore and the very odd election of 2000 to gun control and affirmative action and same-sex marriage, and so on. So I'm hoping that if a reader closes his or her eyes before opening my book and just thinks about 10 or 15 topics that she hopes is covered by the book, I'm hoping that at least half of them are, in fact, in the book. It's a current defense book about the most important issues of constitutional issues of the last 20 years. And in this book, unlike the others, I'm not merely describing events as I do as in the story and in some of the other books, but I'm actually a participant in some of them. I try to tell the story of my own involvement in trying to persuade the Supreme Court to uphold Obamacare, trying to persuade the Senate to get rid of its filibuster rules, trying to argue for diversity-based affirmative action, but also for a right to have a handgun in one's home for self-protection, even though I myself don't want to have a handgun in my home for self-protection. The book tries to be non-doctrinaire. I hope that there are things that conservatives will like. I hope there are things that liberals will like.
Well, it sounds like a very comprehensive checklist of these issues, and all of them extremely vital to the future of this nation, this republic. In addition to the issues the court has to deal with. We have the court itself, which is a looming issue for all of us, which is we're looking at 2, maybe 3 vacancies in the next presidential term, and perhaps that not being hyperbolic this time, but maybe this is the most important election in terms of the future of the court in a long, long time.
And not just the court. I would say the country. And frankly, I predicted that this might happen. I saw it coming, which is why I wanted this book, the only current events book I have ever written and probably will ever write. I wanted this book to coincide with the election of 2016. That's why it was published right after Labor Day 2016, because for the first time really since 1864, since the age of Lincoln, all 4 branches of federal policymaking, the House, the Senate, the judiciary, and the presidency are all in play. Come January, the Republicans could control all of them, or the Democrats could control all of them. Come January, Donald Trump could be president, and if he is president, I think he pretty much carries the Senate with him, and that guarantees that he will fill a Scalia vacancy, and therefore it will be a Republican-controlled court, as it has been in recent memory. If all of that happens, he will carry the House as well, quite likely. Or Hillary Clinton could be president. If she is elected, she's likely to carry the Senate. That means that she's going to fill that Scalia vacancy with a friendly Senate, and even possible for her to carry the House. Not highly likely, but quite possible. And that hasn't happened really since 1864, when it was clear that all 4 were in play at the same time: House, Senate, Judiciary, Presidency. Because for most of the period after Lincoln and until Franklin Roosevelt, the court wasn't in play. It was dominated by Republicans. And then after Roosevelt, for most of the period until the Gingrich Revolution, the House of Representatives and the Senate weren't really in play. They were dominated by Democrats. And for the last 50 years, since 1970, the Supreme Court has been controlled by Republican appointees. It's really now the first time that it's in equipoise. So I kind of saw that was likely to happen, and that's why I wanted to time this book, this current events book, to coincide with what I was expecting to be a pretty momentous election. What I frankly did not see coming is Donald Trump, who has added an additional dimension because we've never seen anyone like him getting this close to the presidency.
Indeed. Everything you just said summarizes how critical the decision to vote this November is in terms not just the future of the legislature, but the judiciary, and may set its tone and its philosophy for a good part of the century.
Every election, and especially every presidential election, is a constitutional referendum of sorts. The Constitution provides that presidents and senators pick judges. Judges aren't supposed to pick presidents. That's what's wrong with Bush versus Gore, and I say so in the book. Presidents and senators are supposed to pick judges, and we, the people, pick presidents and senators. That's not a bug. That's a feature of our system. Judges don't clone themselves. They don't pick their own replacements. They don't pick their chief. They don't pick their subordinates. Presidents and senators do, and we pick presidents and senators, and we do so in these special election years. So these special election years, especially presidential election years, are all with constitutional referenda of sorts. And we can't discharge our obligation to perform that function. Voting is not just a right, but a duty. It's a responsibility without having a sense of the larger constitutional tradition. So that's why I thought this is the time for me to write a book about current events, where I have chapters on each of the branches of government. There's a chapter on the presidency, and indeed even one on the vice presidency. There's a chapter on Congress. There's a chapter on the judiciary. And then, of course, there's lots of stuff about the case law in particular. But as with all my books, I think the Constitution ranges far beyond the judiciary. So every one of my books tries to talk not just about the judiciary, but the Constitution outside the courts.
Well, I would, if I could, I would have every voting citizen read your book before the election, but that's probably not realistic.
You are doing everything you can, and I'm very grateful to you and all my friends at the LA Review as well.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today, and I hope that I hope that this interview will help spur people to dig into your book and see the see the fascinating discussion that you have of all these vital issues. Thank you again.
Thanks, my friend. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay.